of you to our monthly membership meeting, this time titled The Salish Sea Ecosystem Threats and Opportunities. As always, the public is welcome, so we're glad to have all of you here. If you're interested in joining our league, there are brochures and membership forms on that back table. I'm Claire Kelm, this year's president of the League of Women Voters of the San Juans. For those of you who have not attended an LWV meeting before, the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization whose purpose is to promote the informed and active participation of citizens in government. As an organization, the League does not support or oppose candidates for office. We do advocate on those issues chosen by the membership for study and action after reaching consensus. I want to tell you about two of our meetings coming up. The next one on April 9th here at the library. Sarah Crosby and Laura Jo Severson are putting this program together about the Electoral College. Since the Electoral College has become somewhat of a flashpoint in our democracy these days, we felt it was time to help people understand more fully why it was created, what has changed in our country since its inception, and why many people feel it should be abolished. Yet, there are still many out there, and it's not necessarily a partisan situation either, who feel that it is still needed, perhaps with some tweaking. And we're going to present some of these possible tweaks that have been suggested. So as soon as I heard this from Laura, Jo, and from Sarah, I thought, I really need to listen to this. I need to understand this. So I think it's going to be a great program. And I also want to briefly mention that our annual meeting luncheon is coming up on May 14th at the Grange. So be sure to mark your calendars, April 9th, May 14th, and you'll be getting more information about that luncheon. Now, Susie Dellendorf is going to introduce our Salish Sea speaker.
Today, we are privileged to have as our speaker, Lovell Pratt, Director of the Friends of the San Juan's Marine Protection Program. A San Juan resident since 1991, Lovell has over 25 years of experience working and volunteering in local government, agriculture, affordable housing, and education. She has served on the San Juan County Council and spent a decade on the Planning Commission. Heroic. She was named Citizen of the Year by the San Juan Journal in 2008 for her work in affordable housing as Executive Director of the San Juan Community Home Trust. She is an expert on commercial vessel safety issues and will represent Friends in advocating for safe shipping and protection for marine species before government in Washington, D.C., Olympia, and British Columbia. The mission of the Friends of the San Juans since 1979 has been to protect and restore the San Juan Islands and the Salish Sea for people and nature, championing clean water, forests, food, and healthy communities through science, education, and advocacy. Please welcome Lovell Pratt.
Well, thank you very much. It's really great to be here today. Just a show of hands, how many people were here in 2014 when Sean Hubbard and I did the presentation on vessel traffic? Okay, good. So this will be an update to that presentation. I also want to say that I've got some literature in the back table about Friends of the San Juans, if anybody's interested. And if anybody would like to be on the mailing list, I'm going to pass around a pad of paper and you can add your email and we can get you added to the list. So maybe Susie, if you could start that. And I don't know if anybody has an extra pen.
I have an extra pen.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Thanks.
It's great to be here, and I'll just go ahead and get started with the outline of what I'm going to talk about today. So we're going to start with talking about commercial vessel traffic and touch on whale watch boats, although primarily we're going to be looking at the very large commercial traffic in our region. And then two projects in particular, the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline Expansion and the Tesoro Refinery Xylene Project. The Tesoro Refinery, soon after they submitted their application to manufacture xylene, they rebranded and changed their name to Endeavor. So it's a little confusing because the project is known both by the old refinery name, but now they have a new name, Endeavor. I'm going to talk about southern resident killer whales. But of course, in terms of vessel noise impacts, we have a real expert in the room, Val Veers. So if there's any follow-up questions about that, I'll ask Val to step in. We're going to talk about Atlantic salmon net pens, and then changes to the shoreline that impact forage fish spawning beaches and wild salmon habitat. And then we'll talk a little bit about point source pollution and non-point source pollution in terms of impacts to the Salish Sea. And one thing I just want to start out with, I am going to be talking about some of the legislation that was, yeah, we should get some more seats out. That's great. Thank you. Anyways, there was some great successes in this year's legislative session that just ended on Friday, or on Thursday. And we have so much to be grateful for in terms of our representatives for the 40th District. I mean, let's just give a round of applause to our representatives. Especially in terms of environmental bills, Senator Kevin Rankin and Representative Chris Litton were just phenomenal this year. Ranker, yes. Let's get started. And here we are in the Salish Sea. And you can all see where we are in the San Juan Islands here. This is San Juan Island. And of course, this isn't the entire Salish Sea. The entire Salish Sea is the entire watershed going all the way south of Olympia, all the way, we can see Vancouver, BC right there, but north of that is also included in the Salish Sea. But this is an aerial photo just to give us orientation. And now we're going to look at the Canada-US Cooperative Vessel Traffic Management System map. And so this gives you, it shows you the vessel traffic lanes in gray, and it shows you the areas in terms of how they're managed by the two countries. So over here off the coast, in that in the area off the coast there, that's managed by Canada out of Tofino. The green area in the Strait of Juan de Fuca is managed by the U.S. out of Seattle, the Vessel Traffic Service based in Seattle. And then the crosshatch area in Harrow Strait and Boundary Pass up here is managed by Canada out of Victoria. And for a mariner, as I understand it, for professional mariners, the vessel traffic management is seamless. As ships cross through these various areas, they're passed off between the various vessel traffic services, and it's a system that does work really well. Although, as we're going to find out later, there's some differences with the way that the U.S. and Canada does water management safety. Janet, do you have a question?
Is Rosario Strait not part of the system?
So Rosario Strait is managed by the U.S. So what they're doing here is showing the transboundary waterways and how they're managed. Mm-hmm. So you have to imagine this line that goes along the Strait of, down the middle of the Strait of Juan de Fuca and up the middle of Harrow Strait and Boundary Pass. And that line is, they're showing how the vessel traffic is managed in the transboundary area. So good question, thank you. So I just want to give you a sense of how much commercial vessel traffic do we have in this region. And this is data from the Maritime Administration, the U.S. Maritime Administration, from 2015, and it's the most recent data we have available. And they took all the largest ports in the U.S. and they ranked them according to different criteria, but this ranking is in terms of total vessel calls. Mm-hmm. And we have 6 ports and refineries in the Salish Sea in the U.S. that made the top 100 ranking list. So Tacoma, Washington, Seattle, Washington, Cherry Point, which includes both Phillips 66 and BP refineries, Port Angeles, which is another port, Anacortes includes both Shell and Tesoro refineries, and Everett. And then if you combine those 6 ports, we would rank, those ports would rank number 9. But then all the vessel traffic coming into the Strait of Juan de Fuca, whether it's bound for the Port of Vancouver in Canada or any of these ports or other ports in the U.S., it all funnels through the Strait of Juan de Fuca, right? And so if you add in the Port of Vancouver, which is Canada's largest port, we would rank number 3 in the U.S. So Houston ranks number 1, and New Orleans ranks number 2. And by Houston, it's like all the ports in that area. And also in New Orleans, it's a combination of ports in that area. And I have to say that the way Canada tracks their vessel calls, they only count the foreign vessel calls, which isn't true of the way vessel calls are counted in the US. So if we had all the vessel calls for the Port of Vancouver, the number would be much higher. Yes?
Are these all ocean-going vessels or only tankers?
No, these are all of the commercial ships.
All over a certain
So
size?
all the container ships and cargo ships, all the ones that are commercial calling at these major ports.
Yeah.
And barges?
Yep.
Barges.
Yep.
So it'd be over a certain size? I don't know if there's some that are small.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably, I don't know the details of that. I can find out if you want me to. Yeah. So that's just to give you a sense, just the 30,000 foot view of, so how big is, in terms of commercial vessel traffic, where do we rank in compared to the rest of the US? Now, I did say I'm going to focus mostly on the large commercial ships, but I just want to touch on the whale watching industry. And this is a graph, so the Whale Museum, their program Sound Watch, which goes out to educate boaters about their interaction with the southern resident killer whales and the whales, and they make a report every year. So this is their report for 2016, and they're just showing, going back to 1976 all the way up through 2016, the number of commercial whale watch boats. And you can see the number has gone up substantially over time. And so, of course, when we talk about the southern resident killer whales, which we will talk about later, there is noise impact from vessels, and both from the large commercial vessels, but then also the whale watch vessels as well. So I didn't want to lose sight of that piece of it. So what's changing since we did this presentation for you back in 2014 in terms of vessel traffic in our region? So one thing is that ships are getting bigger, and that's true of a lot of different types of ships. But just talking about container ships, this was from, in 2016, the Benjamin Franklin called on the Port of Seattle, and it is a huge ship. So this is 1,300 feet long, so it's like if you compare it to the Salish ferry, it would be 3 to 4 times longer. I mean, it's just gargantuan. And it carries 18,000 TEUs. So a TEU is a 20-foot equivalent unit. And the containers, these individual containers that are on vessels, those are 20 feet. So it just gives you a sense of how many of those can be held by that ship. More typically, the container ships we see in this area range from like 9,000 to 11,000 TEUs. So this is a huge ship. So that's a change. And likewise, a big ship like this, I don't know how many barrels or gallons of propulsion fuel it carries, but of course it's going to have more propulsion fuel on board. And when we talk about vessel traffic, oil spill risk, even those vessels that don't carry oil as cargo have the risk of an oil spill because of the propulsion fuel they have on board. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. And that's a project that we talked about back in 2014. This is a pipeline that goes from Alberta, Canada, to British Columbia, to Burnaby, British Columbia. And it's they would, right now there's an average of about 60 tankers a year, and that number would go up so that there would be 408 tankers a year if this project becomes operational. When we spoke to you in 2014, the permitting process was still ongoing. That permitting process has been concluded. But one thing I want to bring to your attention is the Puget Sound pipeline. So if you can see this map, up at the top there's the border between British Columbia and Washington State. And there's a spur that comes off the Trans Mountain Pipeline called the Puget Sound Pipeline. And that delivers the Canadian diluted bitumen crude oil to the 4 northern refineries. So BP and Phillips 66 up near Ferndale, and then Shell and Tesoro/Endeavor down in Anacortes. And so that's how those 4 refineries receive their Canadian diluted bitumen crude oil. The U.S. oil refinery down in Tacoma receives its Canadian diluted bitumen crude oil by barge. So there was a presentation that Kinder Morgan made to investors in December last year, and I'm going to talk about the top left section of this. This is a slide from their presentation, and this is the first time I've seen quantified what their intention was for expanding the Puget Sound pipeline. So right now, the capacity of the pipeline is an average of about, let me get the number here, 240,000 barrels per day. And they would more than double that capacity.
Excuse me, that says million.
Right, so, trust me on this, it's, what that means is, it's 240,000 barrels per day in US language. And they would more than double that to approximately 500,000 barrels per day. And then they also in this slide, if you remember previously, the project said that they would expand the pipeline to deliver 890,000 barrels per day to Burnaby, or through the pipeline total. And in this slide, they say, well, actually, we could up that to 1,200,000 barrels per day without a lot more investment. With additional power and capital without significant pipeline looping. And this was something during the permitting process that we had many of the commenters brought to the attention of Canada's National Energy Board, and they totally disregarded that concern. Yes, Janet?
So this pipeline is 1952 vintage. She's a little younger than I am. And did they build a new pipeline or just increase the something station pressure, all those pressures? This really concerns me because...
Yeah, and Janet Alderton is on the Governor's Pipeline Advisory Council.
Citizens Committee on Pipeline Safety.
Thank you. So she's a real expert on this. So the existing Puget Sound pipeline varies in, so the throughput is dictated by how big the pipeline is, pretty much. And there are sections of the Puget Sound pipeline that are larger than others. And it's really unclear what kind of permitting would be required for this expansion, whether it would be just the local jurisdictions like Whatcom County and Skagit County, whether Department of Ecology would have to issue permits, or if it would rise to the level of the Utilities Commission, the EFSEC, the, now I gotta translate that acronym. Anyways, it's a committee that looks at utility projects of a certain scale. So it's unclear whether it would rise to that scale to require a state agency to issue permits. So in terms of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, what are our opportunities here? Because as I said, the actual permitting has already been completed at the national level, but there's tremendous opposition. There's opposition from tribes and First Nations, from the city of Vancouver, from the city of Burnaby, from British Columbia as a province, and there's a lot of, I don't know if you've been reading in the news, but there's conflict between the province of Alberta and the province of British Columbia over this project. But just Saturday, there was a huge demonstration up in Burnaby, and this is a picture from that. Thousands of people attended a march, and there's ongoing opposition in many forms, lawsuits, etc., to this project. And we'll see what happens. So then the Tesoro, or newly rebranded Endeavor Refinery in Anacortes, they have been issued a permit by Skagit County for a project to both manufacture and export xylene. So this is a project that would, export 15,000 barrels per day, which is the current amount of xylene exported from the U.S. So it would basically double the U.S.'s export of xylene. It would increase vessel traffic in the region. They would add 20 tankers a year to actually export the xylene to Asia. This is a petrochemical product that's used for manufacturing plastics and other materials. And then it would also increase the vessel traffic with articulated tug barges. And I included a picture here because that's kind of an odd vessel. It's a vessel where this is the tug part of the vessel, and it's integrated to the barge with a pin or other means. Typically when you see a tug and barge out on the water, there's a tug and some sort of a line that connects the tug to the barge, but this is an articulated tug barge. And the articulated tug barges, or they're called ATBs, they would be used to deliver reformate from other Pacific Northwest and West Coast refineries to the refinery in Anacortes, and they would extract xylene from that reformate, and they would take the residual, what they call gasoline blend stock, and they would backhaul that to the refineries of origin. So these articulated tug barges would come in laden with cargo, both coming and going. They bring in reformate and they leave with gasoline blend stock. Yes?
What is reformate?
Good question. It's a byproduct of the refining process. And they can extract the xylene from that. Yes, Janet?
It's very low molecular weight hydrocarbons, a lot of aromatic hydrocarbons like xylene, a lot of benzene, which is a super cancer-causing compound, and very flammable. There was a tanker that exploded off the coast of China a few weeks ago that they couldn't put the fire out, and it eventually sank. It had a product similar to this reformate.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So, excuse me, so where's that material going right now?
So where does the reformate go now from the various refineries? Good
Yeah,
question.
Yeah, the four in our neighborhood.
Oh, well, so this would be used, I don't know, whether, are they shipping it elsewhere? Is that what the question is, instead of shipping it to Tesoro?
What's happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think they use it in their refining process, and then the residual product gets used somehow, and I don't know whether they can use it on site for other products or whether it gets shipped to other areas. Yes.
What kind of containers is it in, or does it just fill the vessel? Get pumped into the vessel and out, or?
Yeah, so there would be cargo bays in the articulated tug barge that would hold the reformate or the gasoline blend stock.
Yeah.
So barrels is a unit of measure. It's not as if the literal barrels are used to hold the product while it's on the vessel. It's just a unit of measure. So they're actually cargo holds that they fill with the product.
So it's a large amount loose in the body of the barge.
There are, it's not one large cargo hold, it's divided up into different sections. But the reason I have this picture up here is one of the concerns about articulated tug barges. Mariners in the industry refer to them as rule breakers. And they refer to them as rule breakers because they typically, they're a replacement for a tanker. And tankers have regulations on how much crew you have to have tug escorts when they're laden. And articulated tug barges, because they're barges, they don't have the same crewing requirements. They don't have to have tug escorts when they're laden in certain places, Washington State included. And so they do have a higher risk of accidents. I mean, that's been shown to be true. So the fact that they're using these kinds of vessels in the project is one concern. So, I don't know if you recall, but in 2015, the U.S. Congress, there had been a ban on the export of U.S. crude oil up until 2015, and Congress lifted that ban at that time. And this is a graph that starts in 1920 and goes up through to 2017, and you can see this exponential spike in crude oil exports after the lifting of the ban. So now we've got 1.1 million barrels per day in 2017 that are being exported, which is just a huge increase since 2015. So a couple of concerns about the projects I've talked about. So and you probably have recalled there have been a couple of project applications to develop new crude oil export terminals in Washington State. And none have been successful in getting the permits they need. And these are projects where they would receive crude oil by rail, typically from Bakken crude from the North Dakota, or in that Bakken shale region. And then they would load it onto ships and export it. And none of those projects have been successful. So there's a concern that our refineries, which are existing facilities, they have wharves, we're concerned that they could be used as a terminal to export crude oil. And that's troubling. Yes, Tom?
Don't we import oil at the same time?
We do, but I didn't include a slide. Our imports of crude oil are going down as we're generating more crude oil. Yes, but you're right. So we have 5 refineries in Washington State, and Washington State, those refineries combined, it's the 5th largest refining state in the nation.
Wow.
And
Really?
And all 5 refineries receive crude oil by vessel. 4 of them receive crude oil by rail. They have rail facilities. And then the 4 northern refineries, as we saw, receive crude oil by pipeline. So there's all these different modes of transportation taking place in this state. And the other thing that's concerning about the Tesoro, Endeavor, Xylene project is that it's the first project application for one of our Washington State refineries to diversify its product line with a new petrochemical product. And as our cars become more efficient and we have alternative energy sources, our demand for traditional gasoline refined products is going to plateau and then go down. And so refineries are already looking, okay, how do I protect my bottom line? Where are my opportunities to diversify? And demand for petrochemicals is projected to increase as an ingredient in different products that we manufacture, that the world manufactures. So it's a significant application, and in that it's the first of its kind, and it's kind of setting the bar for what the other refineries can expect to have to go through in terms of permitting if they choose to diversify their production with new petrochemical products. Okay, so what are our opportunities? We've got different kinds of vessels. We've got bigger vessels, and I realize now I forgot to tell you the container ship slide. I was supposed to tell you that both Canada and the ports of Seattle and Tacoma are looking to increase container ship traffic, both in terms of numbers of ships and numbers of those TEUs. So that's something that is on the rise in terms of project proposals that are in the works now. We've got this new project that Tesoro has proposed that would increase tanker traffic. And then the Kinder Morgan project, which is very concerning and really because of the product. So those ships, the 348 new tankers that would be exporting or transporting through our waters the Canadian diluted bitumen crude oil, this is a product that is really harmful to the environment if it gets spilled. First of all, it's what they call a non-floating oil, which is a very nice way to say it's going to sink. And when oil spills have some ability to contain and collect oils that float on the surface of the water, but it's much more problematic to contain and collect oils that have submerged or sank. And so because of the cargo, because of the nature of the cargo, Bakken crude oil is much less of a concern because it's very light. It does float, it evaporates. I mean, it's still harmful, but it's not, when you compare it to the Canadian crude oil, it's a very different product. Janet.
And the diluent is much more toxic. If it's a winter shipment, they have to add more of these light hydrocarbons than during the summer to make the diluted bitumen flow through the pipelines. And there can be very high levels of benzene, which is this cancer-causing hydrocarbon in that diluent.
Yeah, I don't know if you remember from the presentation we did before, we showed you pictures of bitumen, which is really this tarry, pitchy substance. And to get it to move through a pipeline or to be able to be loaded onto a ship or into a rail car, they have to dilute it, as Janet said, where these highly volatile compounds.
Toxic.
Yeah, highly toxic. Yeah, and when it spills, what happens over time is those two ingredients, the heavier bitumen and the diluent, separate. And that's why it's a submerging and sinking oil. Okay, so opportunities here. First and foremost, we want to prevent an accident and an oil spill from happening in the first place. And one of the ways we do that in the Salish Sea is we have, if you've heard of the Nia Bay Rescue Tug, it's an emergency response towing vessel, so that if heaven forbid a ship loses power and is at risk of going aground or getting into an accident of some kind, they can deploy the emergency response towing vessel, and that vessel can tie a line to the ship and tow it to a port where it can get repaired or whatever it needs and prevent it from having an accident. And the Nia Bay Rescue Tug has prevented accidents. I mean, it has more than paid for itself many times over because it's avoided these accidents that could be so catastrophic. But if you can imagine your geography, you've got Nia Bay way out by the mouth of the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and you've got San Juan Island over here, and the time it would take for that rescue tug to get to a vessel in distress in Haro Strait, it wouldn't make it in time. So Senator Ranker introduced a bill to provide for a new emergency response towing vessel somewhere in the vicinity of the San Juan Islands, and it did not pass. But the bill that would, 6269, that would strengthen oil transportation safety, also known as the Salish Sea Protection Act, that includes funds to do a study and kind of take a baby step towards establishing a new emergency response towing vessel. In addition, the San Juan County Marine Resources Committee has been granted funds through the Puget Sound Partnership to contract for a study that would look at, we've had a number of studies that have looked at oil spill risk. And they've looked at, what's the risk of an accident happening? What's the risk of an oil spill happening? And how big would the oil spill be? But that's as far as it goes. It doesn't look at the consequences. It doesn't look at environmental consequences, and it doesn't look at economic consequences of a spill. So this study would do that. It would say, okay, if there's a spill in San Juan County, what would it cost? What would be the economic impact? What would be the environmental impact? And that's going to be a really important document to help justify an increase in funding on the part of industry to fund a preventative measure, like an emergency response towing vessel, or some other means of preventing an accident from happening in the first place. So those are all really important steps to address vessel traffic impacts. And then again, I mentioned Senator Ranker sponsored this bill, 6269, to strengthen oil transportation safety, known as the Salish Sea Protection Act. And this is a tremendous bill. It does a number of things. First and foremost, the Department of Ecology, the State Department of Ecology, has authority to do a number of things that they don't have the funding to do. So first of all, it provides ecology with the funding just to do what they already have the authority to do, which is huge in and of itself. And the way it funds this is that currently, if Washington State receives crude oil by vessel, that crude oil is taxed 4 cents a barrel. But you recall those 4 northern refineries that get crude oil by pipeline? The crude oil coming in by pipeline is not taxed. And so this eliminates that disparity between the taxing of crude oil that comes into the state and applies the 4 cents a barrel to the pipeline. So that additional funding, first and foremost, will fund ecology to do what it already has the authority to do. And then it also will do some things that will, so as I told you about the Canadian crude oil, the diluted bitumen, that's a non-floating oil, it sinks. So it provides some additional funding to address additional regulations that would address oils that are non-floating, sinking oils. Very important. It also provides some funding to increase our coordination with Canada, because we have these shared waters and we really do waterway management very differently in the US and in Canada. and we collect data differently, so there's ways in which we can coordinate better to improve waterway management in our shared waters. So this bill provides some funding to do that. And then it provides funding, as I said before, so it would research an additional emergency response towing vessel, and it would also research requiring tug escorts for articulated tug barges, something that California requires that we don't up here. But there was a study that looked at what would be the benefit of requiring tug escorts for articulated tug barges, and they determined that it would reduce accident risk by about 15%. So that's significant. Okay, so now, as you can see, there's orca whales in the foreground of this photograph with a tank ship there in the background. And so we're going to look at impacts, vessel traffic impacts on southern resident killer whales. And first and foremost, when southern resident killer whales were listed as an endangered species, and when the management plan was adopted, one of the things they talked about was the risk of a major oil spill. And back, 20, maybe almost 30 years ago, the Exxon Valdez oil spill up in Alaska, that totally eliminated an entire group of orca whales up there. So if the orca whales, because they're such a small population, if they're in the wrong place when a major oil spill happens, they could be decimated. So that's one major concern. But of course, another major concern is noise impacts. And this graphic here is from, so the Port of Vancouver has a program called ECHO, which stands for Enhanced Cetacean Habitat and Observation. And they're trying to identify ways to reduce the impacts of vessel traffic on the southern resident killer whales. And so one thing they did was this past August, September, October timeframe, they had a voluntary slowdown of commercial vessels. And we still don't know all the details of the outcome of that trial slowdown, but it did reduce, when the vessels slowed down, it did reduce the noise coming from the vessels, and it also reduced the ambient noise throughout the area from vessels. Another thing that's happening is on Wednesday, Governor Inslee is going to announce the Southern Resident Killer Whale Task Force. And so this is hopefully going to identify ways to help to protect the southern resident killer whales. And I know that there's probably going to be a few people from San Juan County represented on that task force, but we'll have to wait and find out on Wednesday. The San Juan County Marine Resources Committee has applied for funds to expand the Be Whale Wise program. They're looking to implement flags that would alert boaters to whales being in the area. Sometimes, when whale watching is taking place and orcas are in the area, boaters just zoom right through without realizing there are whales there. So they're trying to find ways to educate boaters about the whale's presence in our waters. And they're also reviewing, there was a meeting with the staff from the prosecuting attorney's office to see if there was, what's possible for San Juan County to do with regard to protecting the southern resident killer whales. And the bottom line is it probably our only option at this point is to implement voluntary measures. So that's being reviewed to see if there's some other voluntary measures we can do. Another bill that's passed through the legislature is 6032, and it's a funding bill. One thing it does is it provides funding to increase the enforcement of the vessel traffic near the southern resident killer whales. So this would be the Department of Fish and Wildlife, increasing the number of patrols that they have. The Sound Watch program through the Whale Museum is educational. It can't do any enforcement action, but the Department of Fish and Wildlife can. And of course, just like all of us who drive, when we see a state trooper by the side of the road, we slow down and obey the speed limit. And boaters, likewise, are far more observant of the requirements for keeping their distance from killer whales and et cetera if the Department of Fish and Wildlife is out on the water. There'd be funding also to reduce underwater noise levels. One other piece of funding is to increase the hatchery production of the Chinook salmon that the orca eat. And then also to develop a long-term action recovery plan. Okay, now we're going to switch over to net pens. And you probably heard about last August, there was a net pen collapse near Cypress Island. And I've got some photos here. I've got a before and after photo in the top right corner and an aerial photo in the bottom left. But there were about 263,000 non-native Atlantic salmon that escaped in this collapse. And the subsequent study proved that it was negligence that caused it. And they still haven't, there was an effort to try to catch all these salmon, but they haven't all been caught by a long shot. And an ongoing concern from this is this issue of Piscine reovirus. And the Wild Fish Conservancy collected 19 of the Atlantic salmon that were captured, and whereas before they would never have access to any of these farm salmon in order to do testing, they could test these salmon, and all 19 of them tested positive for this Piscine reovirus. And it also was a Norwegian strain, which indicates that the salmon were affected when they were put into the net pens. So they were infected at the hatchery before they were put into the pens. And there's a dispute between the Wild Fish Conservancy and some of the environmental community with our state's Department of Fish and Wildlife as to how big a deal this is. There was a study done by marine biologist Alexander Morton who took this picture. So this is a picture of, this is juvenile salmon, wild juvenile salmon, and they're swimming by a net pen. And she did a study up in British Columbia where there are a lot of net pens. And she found that the salmon that had to swim near net pens had a much higher incidence of the Piscine reovirus than salmon that came from a tributary where there weren't net pens. And that pretty much determined that actually the wild salmon were catching this virus from the farm salmon. So this even though the collapse led to legislation that in fact led to a bill that will now phase out net pens, so there will be no new leases for net pens in Washington State, which is a huge success of the legislature this session. And that was Chris Litton's bill that was successfully made its way through. And then the other thing that's happened as a result of the collapse is that the state agencies that have some authority have stepped up their oversight. So the Department of Natural Resources has been looking into other existing net pens, and in fact they found one in Port Angeles that was so egregious they shut it down because it had violated the terms of its lease and was polluting with styrofoam, and they just shut it down. So there's more regulatory oversight. And there's now a new law, as soon as the governor signs it and it goes into effect, that will not, they'll phase out net pens over the next several years. But we still have a concern with the existing net pens with this Piscine reovirus. Yes, David?
What does the virus do?
So, good question. I'm going to refer to my notes here.
I think it affects their hearts so they can't swim as vigorously.
Well, and the other thing that's really concerning is that it leads to a deadly disease. So it leads to what they call HSMI, and unfortunately I don't know what that means, but it's a disease that can kill the fish. So that's the concern there. But it puts them at jeopardy so that they're less able to survive. Salmon have so much going against them at this time, and it just further limits their ability to thrive and survive. So, the salmon populations for this year are way low. And there's a lot of contributing factors, but this is likely one of them. Yes, David?
Has the EPA, under our current president, have they become a real, you would hope that they would be a supporter of everything that's being done by organizations such as yours in the state, the legislature, and everything else. Are they, however, as is happening throughout the country with many aspects of the Trump administration, are they becoming a roadblock? Are they opposing citizen efforts like this? Are they trying to support industry in such a way that they're counterproductive like they are in many other?
I'm not aware
ways
of that in
enforcing
terms of
environmental
net
protections?
pens.
Pardon?
I'm not aware of that in terms of net pens.
Well, any of the aspects of what you're working on, any of the protections, Janet, I know that.
It's ironic, Trump is against NAFTA, wants to renegotiate it, and the owner of the net pens wants to appeal under NAFTA.
Yeah, well, I mean, we'll see what happens, yeah. But I want to say that there has been concern that the government that our governor is being lobbied to not sign the bill. And by the Cook aquaculture industry that has the net pens. So there was an effort last week to get people to call the governor's office and just say, hey, I really support the net pen bill and I hope you sign it. And they are keeping a tally of who's calling in support and who's calling against. I can't see the governor not signing the bill, but it can't hurt to call and say, please sign these bills that we support.
Well, I would be worried about the EPA stepping in and suing the governor or something like that to protect the industry.
I just want to respond to you, David, because we work with the EPA at Orca in terms of the protection zone off the west side of the island. And as you know, we filed for that protection. They had 4 months of public input. And it's basically been put on a shelf, not because the EPA doesn't support it, but for every new project they take on, they have to drop 2 projects. They're worried about their jobs, they're worried about their funding. And the EPA representative that I've worked with Orca, has said, do what you can locally, because we can no longer be as strong and as powerful and as protective as we would like to be. So that's definitely coming down from the top. And one other thing, when the county banned jet ski whale watching, it took a couple years, but it was supported by the Washington State Supreme Court that said that the county had jurisdiction to do that. And I'm really curious as to why that is not being considered on a county level. And I know you may not have the answer to
Yeah,
that.
I don't know the answer to that. That's a good question for Randy Gaylord.
Yeah, well, there's a 26-page decision made by the Washington State Supreme Court. And one of the key sentences in that is that it does not make sense to have activities in the water that harm the land and the wildlife in the water. Mm-hmm. And you know what? And the other thing that was very interesting about that is that the jurisdiction of the county extended out to the international boundary. Mm-hmm. And so it seems as though that particular ruling could apply in any number of ways.
Yeah. Good, like I said, good question for Randy. Yeah.
Maybe it's a question we should all be asking Randy.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is a great logo that Friends of San Juan's currently has on their new t-shirts and sweatshirts. Orcas need salmon, need forage fish, need natural beaches. And just, nature does a great job providing food for our orcas if we just give it a chance. So another impact to our Salish Sea ecosystem are when we've had changes to our shorelines that reduce the ability of forage fish to spawn. And Friends of the San Juan's, the majority of our budget goes to these kinds of restoration projects that get done. This one was from last year on Shaw Island, and there was some armoring along a road that had eroded down onto a beach and was basically burying let's see, it was a smelt spawning site. It is a smelt spawning site. So what they did was they removed the rock rubble, the big rock rubble that was burying the sand that was perfect for the smelt to spawn, and they added in some beach nourishment. And you can see the before and after pictures, and enhanced that site so that it could be a productive smelt spawning site. The project moving forward now, one example is over on Susha, and this is a project where they would be removing road and armoring, and they would also remove a culvert so that they would restore the channel for the fish passage. And this is also a forage fish spawning site. It would be restored. So that's how it looks now, and you'll have to wait till next year to see a before and after picture. And then we're going to just look real quickly at point source pollution and non-point source pollution. So point source pollution, we all know about Victoria sewage, right? It just gets screened and dumped into the water. And just an update, there is a Capital Regional District wastewater treatment facility under construction, and it's supposed to be completed in 2020. So that would finally address that issue. And then another point source of pollution is boats. And right now there's a no discharge zone. This pink area here in the US where they're looking to require boats to only use pump out stations and not discharge into the water. And so that's a process that's underway now. And then non-point source pollution, this is all things like all your vehicle leaks, anything that leaks onto the road that gets washed away in stormwater. Stormwater is a huge source of pollution in the Salish Sea. And then there's agricultural and pet waste and fertilizers, pesticides, fungicides, construction-related runoff when you have exposed dirt. So you had a presentation just at your last meeting from Kendra Smith with San Juan County talking about San Juan County's clean water utility, which used to be known as the stormwater utility. And the way that's priced, the way that those fees are assessed is changing. So that fee is going to go up, and it's also going to change the way funding is used to address stormwater projects right here in San Juan County. Okay, questions? Tom?
I believe that all the military bases around the Sound are exempt from any pollution control, so we don't know what's coming off of there at all.
That's a really good question, and you're right, I don't know the answer to that. Yeah. Yes?
Well, if you want something that's just a little bit hopeful, I just got off a cruise ship, and voluntarily they said, even though they're allowed to dump certain things in the Tasman Sea or wherever, their policy is not to do that. Everything goes back to where it belongs, landfill or otherwise.
Great, yep, that's great.
Yeah, regarding the pipelines to the 4 refineries in our neighborhood, I'm thinking it would be good to expand that capacity because that'll cut down on the trains and the tankers. Am I missing the point?
Well, it depends. So there's a concern that the refineries could behave like a terminal and export some crude. So if they get more crude from Canada, would that mean that they could export crude that they receive by rail from, Brocken crude? It's a question of, or would how the refineries have managed to increase their production incrementally to the point that they don't have to get a permit to increase their production. But if they double the capacity of that pipeline, that's substantial, and what would that mean in terms of refinery production or, export or transport of crude from the refinery? It's all hypothetical.
Right. But at the same time, isn't the North Slope production just falling off precipitously?
Well, yes and no. I think that there is also new discoveries of resources in Alaska, so it's not necessarily, it's a changing or an evolving process. But that's true that where the refineries used to get most of their crude from the Alaskan North Slope, that has declined. But they still do get some, and they still do get other foreign crude from all over the world, comes in by vessel. The concern about the pipeline, while it's a pipeline over land, it still is a concern about pipeline spills. And, in terms of a safety record, I think pipelines have had more spills than vessels in recent years. And when it spills on land, it travels downhill to whatever tributary or directly to the shore, because a number of the pipelines are very close to shore too, or the Puget Sound pipeline. Yeah.
So the pipeline industry says pipelines are safer, and that's true as far as human deaths and injuries, but the volume percentage of crude that is spilled is higher than for shipping of crude. And also refineries cost billions of dollars to build, and if they just suddenly double the volume, probably a lot of that crude oil will be exported unless they.
We don't know. At this
We don't
point, it's
know.
all speculative, but it is telling that Kinder Morgan says this is how we're going to change the capacity of the Puget Sound pipeline. And it's just, and so it's, for me, it's kind of a wake-up call. Okay, we need to really pay attention to all the permitting that goes on for any kind of pipeline expansion and engage where we have an opportunity to make sure that any, consequences of that aren't going to cause impacts that they don't mitigate. Janet?
The Navy is expanding a lot of their activities in the Salish Sea. Do you have information about that?
I don't, no. I know that there's very active group over on Lopez Island in terms of the growler activity. And you might think, well, this is, just jets in the air, but they also have some ability to have discharges of fuel while they're in air, and that's a concern, obviously, in terms of environmental impacts to the Salish Sea. But I don't have
There's a lot of
information on that.
sonar activity going on.
Right.
War games, and they're trying to militarize a lot of the shoreline in the Salish Sea in order to carry out this war game stuff, which has potential for being really destructive for the mainland.
Yeah.
A comment to what Chris Burton just said. I mean, it's one thing to talk about more tankers and pipeline volume coming into the refinery, but something, now it's going to double what comes out of the refinery as well, and you have to look at that. I don't know if you've covered it, I apologize if you have, but if you double the refinery capacity or increase it by X%, whatever it is, where is that production going? How is it getting, if it's gasoline or kerosene or jet fuel?
Oh, okay.
How does it get to wherever it's going? Are there other pipelines or tankers, or what becomes of it?
So, do you all remember the Magnuson Amendment? Mm-hmm. So this was an amendment back when Senator Magnuson was in office that would limit tanker traffic in the Salish Sea or east of Port Angeles. And one of the things that was identified at the time was that the refinery capacity in Washington State wouldn't increase beyond what was required to provide fuel for Washington State. So I know that we do have, I'm just going to go to a slide I didn't include. So this is data from the Washington State Department of Ecology, and it shows tank ships bound for Washington ports via the Strait of Georgia and Harrow Strait, and you can see that spike in 2016. And that is from one tank ship that's delivering aviation fuel from the Shell refinery up to Canada for their, the Vancouver airport. So, but I think historically, the refineries have provided aviation fuel to Canada. And the pipeline that provides refined fuels from the refineries goes further south than the Washington State line. It goes down to the Portland area. So that's a really good question, and it's it could be that the doubling of the capacity of the Puget Sound pipeline would reduce the amount of crude that comes in by ship or by rail, and it would be a net same, but it's unlikely that there wouldn't be an increase somehow that they would have to address, whether it was through more refining or whether it was through transport or export of the crude, we don't know.
So there is a pipeline going south from these refineries to Seattle and
With refined product.
California. Refined product, yes.
Not a crude oil pipeline, but
No,
refined
I'm talking
product.
about
Yep,
refined product,
yep.
okay.
Yes,
Lovell?
Tom.
Yeah. with regard to the regulatory environment of Canada and maritime traffic versus the US, and all these tankers going up Perro Strait, could you compare the
Yeah.
regulatory environment? Because
Great.
I think there's some
Yeah.
important differences that.
So one thing I really appreciate about the waterway management in the U.S. is there is this group called the Puget Sound Harbor Safety Committee. And it meets every other month, and it's a very inclusive meeting. The public is welcome to attend. They do have a set number of actual members who technically vote, but I go and I speak up all the time, and they have always made decisions by consensus as far as I can tell. And it's a very proactive group. So if they see that there's a pattern of incidents taking place, this is where you don't have an accident, but there's something wrong because you have a repetitive incident that takes place, they proactively establish a standard of care. So to go through a regulatory process to establish a best practice as a regulation takes years, if not decades. I mean, it just takes forever. Through the Puget Sound Harbor Safety Committee, if they see the need to implement a best practice to address incidents that are taking place, it just happens immediately. And the way that they enforce it is typically, so this is like a best practice. It's a standard of care. It's non-regulatory, but apparently in a court of law, if a mariner is found to not have used this best practice, they would be somehow liable. So there's that incentive. Plus, they've used peer pressure to get whoever is not adopting a best practice to adopt it. It's really an effective process, really fantastic. In Canada, they have a group, but it's only comprised of professional mariners. It's a closed meeting, not open to the public, very closed process. The data is not shared publicly, and they don't have the same system of adopting standards of care where needed. So it's a very different approach.
Just for instance, I see tankers, small tankers going up Perro Strait on a regular basis to Vancouver. They're never escorted.
So these are probably the articulated tug barges?
No.
Oh?
No, they're probably smaller than a lot of those that go to Anacortes.
Okay. There
But
is a size, even in the U.S., it's a tanker of a certain size that's required to have tug escorts. So they could be under that threshold. Yeah. Jenna?
So when they made this law requiring tug escorts for vessels of a certain size, tankers of a certain size, the industry started to try and evade that by using the articulated barges and maybe smaller tankers that were just below the threshold, because having tug escorts costs more money.
Yeah.
So half of the oil crude oil that's now transported in the Salish Sea is not escorted as a consequence.
Yes.
Are all refineries located on the seacoasts?
Yes. Yeah, so so that they can receive the crude by vessel. That's a big reason, and so that they can transport the crude by vessel, or transport the refined products by vessel. Yeah.
But, I mean, it seems to me there's a lot of space in the middle of the country that uses all of these oils, or uses the refined product.
So there's refineries all over the country, yes.
Oh, there are?
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
yeah. So, and crude gets moved by pipeline and rail in addition to vessel. So, so we've got this concern about Canada transporting their Canadian diluted bitumen crude oil by pipeline and loading it on ships. And so people say, well, why don't you just refine it in Alberta and then just transport the refined product, which is much safer if it spills and much less harmful to the environment. But they haven't done that.
My late wife, Wilma, was heavily involved in trying to find out why the cancer rate in the county was so high. And one of the things she looked at, and I can't remember exactly where she heard it from, was that back in probably the late 50s, the Navy dumped barrels and barrels of stuff, undetermined stuff, into Harrow Strait, and those barrels are probably releasing whatever was in them by now. And you might want to follow that up, and I don't know how you do that. You could request the Navy to tell us what they did, I suppose.
Yeah.
But that was kind of a creepy sort of piece of information that she found.
Yeah, well, even just the ability to dump fuel that they currently still have the ability to do. I mean, that, all that particulate in the air coming down and then once it reaches the ground, I mean, that's concerning too.
Yeah, well,
Okay.
that stuff is likely to be much worse than any of that.
Okay,
But we
yeah.
don't know at this point.
Yeah. Okay, one last question.
Americans like to take action. We don't like to listen to things like this and just feel frustrated or anxious. So what can you give us?
Well, good question, thank you. So as you recall, I said one option is to call the governor's office. Please encourage Governor Inslee to sign the bills that are on his desk that the legislature has approved that you support. And so definitely asking the governor to sign the net pen bill would be great. But even the oil transportation, strengthening oil transportation safety bill, whatever bills you support, you know, good for the governor to know that there's support for him to sign the bills and put them into law. And his number is 360-902-4111, but you can find that online. And really nice staff people answer the phone and we'll take your comment. You know, and the other thing I really encourage you, especially for these bills, the oil spill and the net pen bill, and you know, to thank Senator Kevin Ranker, to thank Representative Chris Litton. They had an amazingly successful legislative session, and we just have so much to be thankful for to them. So really champion them to continue this good work and follow. So you know, as I said, the bill that Kevin Ranker sponsored in terms of the an emergency response towing vessel, an additional one to be located somewhere near us, even though that bill wasn't successful this time around. Oftentimes, you know, bills, it takes several sessions for them to be successful. So encourage him to, you know, keep working on that and put it out there again next year, because that's something that we really want to champion.
Oh, sorry, that was one last question. But sometimes I...
Well, go ahead, and then I want to get to Emily's question too. Yeah.
I pretend I'm a Canadian, because we are really sort of nestled up there near Canada. And they have the Dogwood Initiative organization that had a link to a questionnaire, public questionnaire, all about this kind of stuff. And I just pretended I was a Canadian.
Yeah, and I think along those lines, though, there was recent coverage by Linda Mapes from the Seattle Times about this demonstration that took place on Saturday up at Burnaby and opposing the Kinder Morgan project. And she had a quote in there from Dale Jensen, who's the head of the Spills program with our Department of Ecology. And there's concern that Canada, as with waterway management, Canada is at a different place in terms of their spill response capacity. Washington State is the envy of the rest of the country in terms of what we have here in terms of spill preparedness and response capacity, although there's always room for improvement, and there are certainly examples where we're not, you know, up to the same level as other states on certain things. But Canada is way behind Washington, and that is very concerning. And that was expressed in the article. But I would urge you to encourage our governor, to encourage our representatives to engage more in these projects in Canada, because the reality is most of the vessel traffic coming into our waterways is going to Canada. Mm-hmm. You know, remember, the Port of Vancouver is the biggest port in Canada. So they get the lion's share of the vessel traffic goes there. So all the project proposals there really should have engagement by Washington State in terms of project impacts and how they'll get mitigated. Because, you know, an oil spill isn't going to respect the international border, right? I mean, if we have a spill in Harrow Strait, you know, where's it coming ashore? San Juan County, for sure. It's not going to stay over in Canada. And that's a huge concern. So Emily, you had a question. I'll do that for the last one.
I talked with someone a while ago that one of the problems with tankers coming that are licensed in other countries deal with different requirements for the skills of the captains and so forth. Has there been any discussion of any, say, maybe some certain requirements that these tankers or whatever from other countries need to meet as well as our country?
Well, just speaking for tankers that call on U.S. ports, the U.S. Coast Guard does have a very rigorous, it's called a vessel response plan that's required for any vessel that calls on a U.S. port. And so a number of the vessels that are actually going to Canada also call on a U.S. port, so they'd have to have a vessel response plan with the U.S. Coast Guard. And the U.S. Coast Guard is very proactive in inspections and being proactive in terms of if they see a vessel where there's issues with, language barriers even, or, let alone, equipment issues. I mean, I think they're pretty proactive. I don't know if there are vessels that call on Canada that don't also call on the U.S. I don't know as well how proactive the Canadian Coast Guard is in that regard. But that is a real concern, and I think what's more of a concern is that the U.S. has a requirement for vessels to have a certain level of responsibility. That if there's a spill, they are on the hook to pay for a certain amount of the cleanup, the response activities and the remediation. But it's limited, and typically vessels are like each vessel is its own LLC. And it has its liability insurance to cover what it's required to cover, and that's it. And that's not going to be enough. I mean, that's the reality. If we have a major spill, that cap is going to be exceeded pretty quickly. And it used to be that the U.S. had an oil spill liability trust fund that would pay for the costs of responding to a spill, the damages from a spill, above and beyond what the responsible party could pay. And they're no longer collecting funds for that. So they've stopped collecting funds for that. It is what it is, and that's a concern because that was a fund that was growing over time and was there in the case of need. But so that's even more of a concern, I think, than from the U.S. perspective. Yeah. Well, thank you all so much.
Thank you, Lovell, that was wonderful.
Thank you.
Very much.
And thank you for your work, Lovell. Yeah.